Most people spend their entire adult lives trying to solve the wrong financial problem. They believe the main question is how to earn more income. It is an understandable mistake when you are young, broke, and still trying to build some kind of life. Income looks like the whole world. You work. You get paid. You hope the paycheck gets a little larger each year. You celebrate the raise. You fear the layoff. You negotiate your bonus. You count the cash that arrives in the account and assume that this is what money is. That is how most people live. It is also why most people never understand how the wealthy actually operate. The wealthy do not think about money the way wage earners think about money. That is not because they are smarter in some grand mystical way. It is because they are playing under a different set of incentives. And once you see those incentives clearly, the whole machine of modern wealth starts looking very different. There is a joke people sometimes tell about billionaires. They say a billionaire would not bother bending down to pick up a $100 bill on the sidewalk, because in the time it would take him to stop and pick it up, he would have earned more than that anyway. It is a funny line. It is also wrong in the most important way. Billionaires do not earn money by the minute the way salaried people imagine they do. They are not standing there with some invisible hourly meter running above their heads. That is the fantasy of labor. The truth is much stranger and much more revealing. Most great fortunes are not built from income. They are built from ownership. And once a fortune is built from ownership, the owner stops interacting with taxes, debt, and liquidity the way ordinary people do. That is the part most people never really learn. They see the private jets, the foundations, the homes, the yachts, the stock holdings, the art, the giant public commitments, and they ask one obvious question: where does the cash come from if the richest people claim to pay themselves almost nothing? That question matters because the answer explains far more about the modern financial system than most civics classes, economics classes, or personal finance books ever will. I have spent a long life thinking about capital, how it grows, how it compounds, how it gets misallocated, how it gets taxed, how it changes the character of the owner, how it changes the options available to a family, and perhaps most importantly, not in the romantic sense, in the practical sense, a person who owns productive assets is living inside a different math from the person who lives by selling labor alone. That is not ideology. That is structure. The world loves to tell people that if they just work hard enough, save carefully enough, and make sensible decisions long enough, they will eventually arrive at financial freedom by climbing the income ladder. That is true only up to a point. Income can improve life enormously. Income can rescue a family from chaos. Income can turn a frightened household into a stable one. Income matters. But income has enemies, large enemies. Taxes, inflation, lifestyle expansion, debt payments made from after-tax dollars. And, perhaps worst of all, the simple fact that income tied to labor always requires your continued participation. A salary is not a machine. A salary is a trade. You give time, attention, energy, and part of your life. You receive. There is nothing dishonorable about that. Most people begin there. But if a person never graduates beyond that framework, he stays trapped in one of the least tax-efficient and least scalable forms of economic life. That is the first harsh truth. The tax system does not treat all dollars equally. It treats labor dollars much more aggressively than capital gains sitting inside assets. That distinction is the opening move of the whole game. People hear the names of the very rich and assume those people must be receiving enormous salaries. After all, if you run a giant corporation, the public thinks your paycheck must be gigantic. Sometimes it is in a relative sense. Often it is not in the sense that matters. Elon Musk has gone through long periods drawing no conventional salary worth discussing. Jeff Bezos for years took a base salary that looked laughably small relative to the scale of Amazon. Mark Zuckerberg's formal salary has been symbolic. My own salary at Berkshire has remained modest for decades compared with the size of the company and the size of my holdings. That is not an accident. It is not public relations theater. It is structure. Because once you are wealthy enough, salary becomes an inferior way to get rich. Salary is too visible, too taxable, too blunt, too tied to labor, rather than ownership. The real wealth sits elsewhere. In stock, in private businesses, in investment funds, in real estate, in operating companies, in claims on future cash generation that can rise in value without triggering tax immediately. That is the realization principle at work. Most people have never been taught to notice how important that principle really is. The realization principle says, in plain language, that you do not owe tax on the gain in an asset until you sell it. This is one of the most consequential rules in the entire system. And because it is presented so quietly, most people never stop to appreciate what it does. Imagine a man buys a house for $100,000. Over a long period of years, that house becomes worth $1 million. He feels richer. And in an important sense, he is richer. But he does not owe the IRS tax merely because the house became worth. The gain is unrealized. That phrase matters. Unrealized gains are the kingdom where great fortunes quietly expand. The owner becomes wealthier. The asset becomes more valuable. The net worth grows. And yet no tax is triggered simply because the market value rose. That is an extraordinary advantage. A salaried worker does not enjoy it. If he earns another $50,000 in wages, the tax system notices immediately. If his payroll grows, the taxes grow. If a stock position, a real estate holding, or a business ownership stake grows by millions, the owner may owe nothing right then, as long as he does not sell. This is not a loophole in the sloppy accidental sense people like to imply. It is a central structural feature of capital markets. It privileges ownership over labor. That is why I keep saying that the truly important distinction in modern life is not simply how much you earn. It is whether you are still living as a laborer in a cash system or whether you have begun moving into ownership inside an asset system. The asset system behaves differently. It gives you new options. And the most important of those options is that you do not have to sell in order to feel wealthier. Most ordinary people find this hard to grasp because they still think of wealth in checking account terms. If the money is not in the bank, they ask, how can it be useful? That question is natural. It is also the question of someone still standing outside the gate, because once you own large enough assets, the point is not to sell them and trigger tax. The point is to borrow against them. That sentence alone explains half the financial aristocracy of the modern world. Buy, borrow, die. People say those words now as though they are some clever internet discovery. The basic logic has been understood by wealthy families for a very long time. The internet merely gave the arrangement a catchy name. The idea itself is very old. Buy appreciating assets, do not sell them if selling creates unnecessary tax. Borrow against the appreciated value when you need liquidity, then structure the estate so that death resets the basis and the gains disappear for tax purposes. It is an astonishingly elegant system if you are on the inside of it. It is also deeply revealing if you are outside it and trying to understand why the rich seem to play by economic rules that do not apply to everyone else. Let me slow this down because it is too important to rush. Phase 1 is ownership. The wealthy do not obsess over stacking large piles of idle cash. They buy assets that can appreciate, stocks operating businesses, real estate, private investments, land, intellectual property in some cases, assets that produce or that at least have a realistic chance of rising in value over time. The key is that the asset sits there, quietly getting larger in market value without forcing a taxable event as long as the owner keeps holding it. This is why rich people do not rush to sell every time something goes up. The average person sees appreciation and thinks cash out. The wealthy see appreciation and think collateral. That is an entirely different mindset. If I own stock worth $100 million and it grows to $150 million, I do not need to sell it to prove that I am wealthier. I can simply let the unrealized gain sit there, growing and remaining largely untaxed for the moment. The worker sees dollars as things to spend. The wealthy owner sees assets as things to borrow against. That is phase 2, borrow. And here is where the system begins looking almost unfair to anyone who has only ever known consumer debt. The average person experiences borrowing as pain. He borrows for a car, a home, college, medical bills, a business that may or may not work, or simply because wages and expenses stop speaking politely to each other. The rates are high or at least uncomfortable. The terms are rigid. The debt is serviced with after-tax income. The bank extracts value relentlessly. And if he falls behind, the bank gets viciously practical. This is what consumer debt looks like. The ordinary household is told, this is just how borrowing works. It is not. It is how borrowing works for people the bank regards as risky and structurally weak. That is different. The wealthy borrow inside an entirely different relationship. If a person has $100 million in appreciated stock, or a large portfolio of commercial real estate, or other quality collateral, the bank does not view him the way it views the average wage earner. The bank sees low risk, not because the wealthy never make mistakes, because the collateral is there. The collateral is liquid enough or valuable enough or stable enough that the bank feels safe extending him a line of credit at terms the average borrower would consider a fantasy. The rich man does not walk in asking for mercy. He walks in with assets. The assets do the talking, and because the loan is backed by strong collateral, the interest rate is lower, the terms are softer, and the money can be used without selling the asset that triggered the opportunity in the first place. This is the part most wage earners miss. A regular person borrows because he lacks money. A wealthy person often borrows because he is trying to avoid generating taxable income by selling assets. Those are not similar acts. They only share a vocabulary word, debt. That is all. If I borrow against appreciated stock or real estate, I now have liquidity without realizing the gain. No capital gains tax. No need to collapse the asset position. No need to interrupt compounding. The asset can continue rising. The loan provides spending power. The interest on the loan, if the structure is built properly, may itself be manageable or even strategically useful. This is where the average person becomes angry, and I understand why. He uses debt to survive. The wealthy use debt to remain tax efficient while living extremely well. That is a hard asymmetry to observe. It is also real. The worker is taxed first, then spends. The owner borrows first, then spends, and may never create a taxable realization at all. That distinction explains far more about inequality than the public political arguments usually do. Now let us talk about why consumer debt is so destructive in contrast. This matters because people hear the elegance of borrowing against assets and start imagining that all borrowing must therefore be sophisticated. It is not. Consumer debt is usually the exact opposite of sophisticated. Take the average household mortgage. At modern rates, a fixed mortgage can still be sensible if used properly. But that does not change what it does to the worker's cash flow. A household buys a home and agrees to spend decades making monthly payments. At current rates, a great many of those payments, especially in the early years, are overwhelmingly interest rather than principal. The homeowner tells himself he is building equity. In the earliest years, what he is often doing is renting money very expensively from the bank while absorbing the maintenance burden, tax burden, insurance burden, and risk of ownership all at once. That is not necessarily foolish. Shelter matters, stability matters. A home can be a sound life choice, but let us not romanticize the arithmetic. A mortgage paid out of wages is not the same creature as a line of credit secured by appreciated assets. The person servicing a mortgage must earn the payment first, then pay income taxes, then pay the bank. He is squeezed twice. First by the tax system, then by the lender. That is the worker's world. Credit cards are worse. Auto loans are usually worse in a subtler way because the collateral depreciates while the obligation remains. Student debt can be brutal depending on the form, the rate, the degree, and the income path it was supposed to support. None of these debts behave like elite borrowing. They are expensive because the borrower is expensive. The bank does not trust the borrower in the same way it trusts hard, appreciating collateral. That is why the rates are higher. That is why the discipline is harsher. That is why the borrower spends years laboring just to reduce a balance that was never creating wealth for him in the first place. Now compare that with the person holding a large appreciated asset base. He borrows at 2.5% or 4% or some other rate far below what the average consumer sees. He uses the money for living expenses, investment, philanthropy, perhaps to buy yet more assets. His original holdings continue compounding. If they rise enough, he can refinance, roll the loan, or expand the facility. The bank is satisfied because the relationship is profitable and the collateral is strong. The borrower is satisfied because he has liquidity without selling. This is the kind of arrangement the average person never sees from the inside, which is why the public remains so confused about how the wealthiest families can appear to live enormous lives while reporting so little conventional income. Conventional income is the wrong lens. Asset-backed liquidity is the right one. This is also why the public obsession with salary figures is often misplaced. When people hear about a chief executive making what sounds like an ordinary salary relative to the size of his company, they think it must be symbolic modesty or public relations. Sometimes it is simply rational tax structure. Why would I choose wages when I can choose ownership? Why would I invite ordinary income tax when appreciation and borrowing give me a better path? The deeper you go into wealth, the less wages matter. That sentence is one of the clearest dividing lines in the whole system. Below a certain level, wages are life. Above a certain level, wages become an inconvenience. That does not make work unimportant. It means the form in which the reward is received changes dramatically. The third phase is death, and here the system becomes truly extraordinary. If a person dies still holding appreciated assets, the tax basis on those assets is generally reset to market value at the time of death. This is called a step up in basis to the average person. It sounds like a dry technical rule. It is not dry, it is dynastic. Imagine a person bought stock decades ago for $1 million. By the time he dies, it is worth $10 million. If he sold during life, the gain might trigger enormous capital gains tax. But if he dies holding the stock and passes it to heirs under current rules, the basis resets. The heirs receive assets valued at $10 million with a tax basis of $10 million. The old gain effectively disappears for tax purposes. If they sell immediately, they may owe little or nothing in capital gains tax because the basis stepped up. Now combine that with the fact that during life the original owner may have been borrowing against the appreciated asset rather than selling it. You begin to see why the phrase buy, borrow, die has such force. Buy the appreciating asset, borrow against it during life rather than selling and paying tax. Then die and let the basis reset, wipe away the accumulated gain. What began as a simple tax rule becomes one of the great engines of multi-generational wealth preservation. This is why estate planning matters so much to the very rich, not because they enjoy legal paperwork for its own sake, because they understand structure, trusts, insurance. Estate vehicles, lines of credit, basis planning. All of these are merely tools for navigating the same basic fact. Ownership behaves differently from labor. The average person assumes death settles the score. In many wealthy families, death cleans the balance sheet and transfers assets under more favorable tax conditions than any ordinary high earner could ever imagine. When people say the tax code favors capital over labor, this is what they mean. Not in some vague political rhetoric sense. In a direct mechanical sense, the worker earns, gets taxed, services debt, spends, and hopes to save. The owner buys, appreciates, borrows, and then resets at death. Those are profoundly different experiences of the same economy. I do not say this to stir resentment for its own sake. Resentment is a useless investment strategy. I say it because the only way to stop being confused by wealth is to understand the plumbing beneath it. The public keeps thinking the rich are richer because they are paid more. Very often they are richer because they are paid differently and taxed differently and financed differently. That is a better sentence. Now, does this mean the average person can simply imitate the rich man by borrowing recklessly against whatever he owns? Of course not. That is the fastest way to misunderstand the lesson. The lesson is not take on more debt because the rich use debt. The lesson is understand why the rich can use debt so differently. They have appreciating collateral, they have low loan to value ratios, they have optionality, they have access to cheaper money, they have income streams, ownership stakes, and advisory teams that let them structure things carefully. They are not using debt to bridge groceries or survive an emergency. They are using debt to avoid selling assets. That is not remotely the same thing. A middle-class family that sees this and decides to lever itself into more consumption is not becoming sophisticated. It is becoming more fragile. The right lesson for the ordinary person is not mimic the behavior without the foundation. The right lesson is begin building the foundation, acquire assets, own pieces of productive enterprise, understand the tax treatment of labor versus capital, understand the price of bad consumer debt, stop confusing income with wealth. These are not motivational slogans, they are structural truths. If I were 25 again and knew everything I know now about the difference between labor and ownership, I would think about my whole life differently. I would still work hard. Hard work matters, but I would stop treating wages as the destination. I would treat wages as fuel to buy assets, fuel to buy ownership, fuel to build a machine that eventually lets capital work harder than my back, my hours, or my calendar ever could. That is the transition people fail to make. They stay in the wage mindset too long. The wage mindset says, how do I get paid more? The ownership mindset asks, what can I own that will rise and eventually produce liquidity or cash flow without requiring my daily labor to remain attached forever? That is the better question. The public also gets one more thing wrong. They assume the wealthy dislike taxes mainly because wealthy people are greedy. Greed is too shallow an explanation. The more interesting truth is that once you understand the structural advantage of unrealized gains and asset-backed borrowing, salary becomes not just expensive but inferior. Why take the high tax path if a more efficient path exists? This is not about villainy. It is about incentives. Systems get the behavior they reward. Our system rewards ownership, patience, appreciation, and tax deferral much more than it rewards wages, and because it does, capital accumulates differently from labor. This is one reason why inflation quietly hurts workers so much more than it hurts large owners. The worker's wages may rise slower than costs. His debt payments stay real. His taxes remain immediate. The owner of good real assets or equity often sees values rise, rents rise, business earnings rise, and the whole structure adjusts upward. Again, ownership behaves differently. I have been saying the same sentence in many forms because people resist it the way patients resist a diagnosis they do not like. Your salary is not your wealth, your asset base is your wealth, and until a person fully absorbs that sentence, he will misread almost every major financial move made by the truly rich. Now, let me say something that matters a great deal. None of this means that the worker is doomed. That is another foolish interpretation. A worker can absolutely build wealth. He just has to use earned income as the beginning, not the end. His advantage is that he still controls his savings rate, his debt decisions, his lifestyle inflation, and his willingness to redirect cash into ownership rather than appearance. A great many people making good incomes never become wealthy because every increase in wages gets absorbed by a larger life. That is a tragic outcome because it means the ladder was used only to climb into a more expensive cage. I do not admire that. I admire the person who takes wage income and repeatedly converts it into assets, broad market funds, real estate if done intelligently, business ownership, private business. If he can operate one well, anything productive that can appreciate, throw off cash, or both. That is how a worker moves closer to the ownership side of the system. Not overnight. Not by copying the tax structure of a billionaire without the collateral to support it, but gradually, decisively by crossing from earning to owning. That is the crossing that matters most. So if I had to reduce this entire subject to a few hard conclusions, I would say it this way. First, the ultra-wealthy do not depend on wages in the way ordinary people imagine. They depend on ownership. Second, the tax code favors unrealized appreciation over realized labor income in profound ways. Third, debt is not one thing. Consumer debt usually traps the ordinary person, while asset-backed borrowing can become a powerful tool for a wealthy owner trying to avoid selling appreciated holdings. Fourth, the final phase of the system, the step-up in basis at death, helps preserve large fortunes across generations. And fifth, the average person should not imitate the superficial behavior of the rich. He should imitate the direction of their incentives, less dependence on labor alone, more ownership, less bad debt, more productive assets, less obsession with salary as status, more obsession with building things that grow even while you sleep. That is the real lesson. The public sees the jet and asks how much cash the owner must be earning. The more intelligent observer asks what assets the owner controls, what debt facilities those assets support, what taxes he has legally deferred, and how much of his financial life has already moved outside the ordinary wage system. That is the adult way to look at modern wealth, not as a mystery, as a structure. Once you see the structure, a great deal of confusion disappears, and once confusion disappears, you can stop envying the wrong things and start building the right ones. That, in the end, is all I really care about. Not outrage, not theater clarity, because clarity is the beginning of rational action. And rational action, repeated for long enough, is how ordinary people slowly move from being taxed and squeezed by the system to owning enough of the system that it begins working for them instead of against them.